Good morning. The Committee on Homeland Security, Subcommittee on Counterterrorism and Intelligence will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony from 4 counterterrorism and homeland security experts. I'd like to welcome the members of the subcommittee, particularly my ranking member, Kathleen Rice, and express my appreciation to the witnesses who have traveled to be here today. And now I recognize myself for an opening statement. In the weeks and months after the terror attacks of September 11th, Congress and the administration worked together to fix the weaknesses which our enemies had exploited to carry out their attacks. We created the Department of Homeland Security, restructured the intelligence community, and launched a war on terror to take the fight to our enemy, all to ensure that a similar attack would not happen again. In the years that followed, however, much of the energy behind these reforms has been lost. Budgets were cut and important legislative initiatives were delayed. By 2013, leaders in national security warned that the country was paralyzed with, quote, terror fatigue. At the same time, the al-Qaeda network evolved and metastasized and spread, and ISIS began to take root. Hundreds of Americans have been radicalized. A year ago, senior national security leaders testified that the U.S. is facing its highest threat level since 9/11. Few could have predicted in 2001 how the world would change over the next 16 years. There has yet to be another spectacular attack claiming thousands of lives, due largely to the heroes in the ranks of our intelligence community, armed forces, first responders, and law enforcement and vigilant citizens. And as Commissioner Davis well knows, the increase of other attacks, though, across the United States, carried out by adherents to the global jihadist ideology and the rapid revolution of terrorist tactics, reveal that our enemy has changed with the times. We must prepare for even more change. Increased pressure on terrorist self-havens and the caliphate in Syria may result in a new terrorist diaspora as thousands leave the conflict zone. Our adversaries, including a newly emboldened Iran, will continue to exploit any available chaos. As the new administration settles in, there is no doubt that we are at a crossroads in U.S. counterterrorism strategy. We must have an aggressive long-term strategy for addressing the Islamic terrorist threat abroad and in the homeland. For years, this committee has worked hard to identify and eliminate weaknesses in U.S. security defenses. Professionals and experts have warned repeatedly about failures to connect the dots and share information between agencies. After-action reviews of various terror attacks have identified individual and systemic failures that remain unaddressed. We have an opportunity to carefully improve the homeland security of the United States. To whatever extent possible, this must include bipartisan cooperation and an eye on the vital issue of the safety and security of Americans. It is absolutely necessary to make progress, as our adversaries will only continue to evolve. This hearing today provides our first step. To build on the foundation of our work in previous Congresses, the witnesses here today will offer perspectives on both the current homeland threat picture and how Congress, working with the administration, can fight to once again fix the weaknesses our enemies now exploit. I look forward to hearing their suggestions for where improvements can be made across our counterterrorism programs and policies. And now I recognize the ranking member, Ms. Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing, and I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony today. As we examine the future of counterterrorism, I think it is important to step back and consider just how much the threat of terrorism has evolved in the past 10 or 20 years. Terrorists today are not leaving our borders, undergoing training in another country, and returning to the U.S. to commit attacks. Terrorists no longer need to seek financing from terrorist organizations, nor do these individuals need the plan or permission of a terrorist group or a particular leader. More and more terrorists can be inspired by propaganda and rhetoric spewed over the Internet. Lone actors, people who are self-radicalized and may not appear on a particular watch list to be flagged at the border, present an especially difficult task for our law enforcement officials. But the Internet is not the only avenue to radicalization. Charged public rhetoric can be a factor, including from our own president. We've heard reports that ISIS refers to President Trump's travel ban as the blessed ban. They point to the ban as proof that the U.S. is at war with Islam and the Muslim world. I think it's important to recognize that words matter, particularly when we have a group like ISIS with such sophisticated communications operations. The words we use do matter, calling for a complete and total ban on Muslims entering the U.S. or going out of your way to call it radical Islamic terrorism. Those words play right into our enemy's hands and do nothing to help our counterterrorism efforts. Additionally, I'm particularly concerned right now about the recent wave of bomb threats made nationwide to Jewish community centers, or JCCs. Last week, I joined several members of Congress in urging the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and the FBI to fully investigate these threats. Over the last 2 decades, JCCs and Jewish institutions have several times been the target of domestic terrorist attacks. We must do more to protect these and similar social, recreational, and cultural facilities. To that end, I would ask Chairman King that this subcommittee commit to examining the work of DHS and FBI to help protect and harden JCCs and other religious institutions from terrorist threats. The threat landscape is ever evolving, and we have a responsibility to evolve with it and to confront the threat of terrorism in all its forms. I look forward to hearing from our expert witnesses today, and I hope this will be a constructive conversation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Rice. Obviously, we're delighted to work with you on this. I know over the years, especially the Jewish community in New York, I can speak of personally, has received extensive Homeland Security funding and training and briefing on how to harden their targets and protect themselves. Obviously, if more has to be done, we will do it, and it's really essential. And again, coming from New York, we're probably even more particularly aware of the nature of those threats. So thank you all, and I look forward to working with you on that. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record, and we are very pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses today on this important topic, and all of you have testified here before, and I want to thank Ed Davis, Tom Jocelyn, Robin Simcox, and Peter Bergen for once again returning. And our first witness is Commissioner Davis. Ed Davis is the President and CEO of Edward Davis, LLC, a business strategy and securities firm. He has a 35-year career in law enforcement, including serving for 7 years as the police commissioner of the City of Boston. Prior to that, he served as superintendent of the Lowell, Massachusetts Police Department, where he spent nearly 30 years. Commissioner Davis has consistently been a strong advocate for interagency collaboration and public safety. He's been a friend and trusted advisor to this committee for a number of years. I believe you testified within 1 or 2 months of the attacks at the Boston Marathon. It was very moving and, more than that, very poignant testimony detailing deficiencies that were there and how you're working to correct them, particularly in your dealings with the FBI. And you've been a great source of information to members on both sides of the aisle. And you've come back time and again. I want to thank you for that. So with that, I recognize former Commissioner Ed Davis, always be Commissioner Davis for his testimony.
Sorry about that. Thank you for the opportunity to speak before you today. As I stated in my 2013 testimony before the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs, this topic is critically important and must remain a top priority for Congress. Our administration, Congress, law enforcement, and private citizens must continue to work together in a coordinated manner. A focus on communication and consistency of funding for multi-jurisdictional training drills, communication tools, and intelligence gathering is essential to prevention and mitigation in the event of an organized or lone wolf attack domestically. Organized and lone wolf attacks are not going away anytime soon. These individuals are nimble and frequently change their methods. The goals, however, remain the same: death, destruction, creation of fear and chaos. Just in 2016, we saw the brutal shooting and explosive attack on the Brussels National Airport in Belgium that killed 32 civilians and 3 of the terrorists. A large truck plowing people down following the Bastille Day celebration in Nice, France, that killed 86 people. Different methods, same goals. More than ever before, relationships between law enforcement partners, stakeholders, and community members needs to be in place to prevent attacks. Law enforcement needs sufficient police resources and updated intelligence to collect relevant information prior to attacks and to truly begin to build trust within all of our communities. Following the attacks on September 11th, counterterrorism efforts in the United States shifted to the prevention of the next domestic terror attack. JTTF, Joint Terrorism Task Forces, already in place at that time, established a working partnership with local, state, and federal law enforcement authorities. At the time of the marathon bombing, there were information-sharing issues that were subsequently changed and improved. These JTTFs have proven to be a tremendous vehicle, encouraging local, federal, and state police to work together as full partners toward our nation's critical mission of protecting the U.S. homeland. And I'm happy to report that in Boston, under the direction of SAC Hank Shaw, the JTTF has been working better than ever. The changes that were put in after testimony at this at the Homeland Security Committee in 2013 remain in place today and are working very well in the city of Boston. Testing of the JTTF systems is important for effectiveness and transparency, however. Every JTTF should be audited at appropriate intervals by the Department of Justice. The audit should include the content of every memorandum of understanding between agencies to ensure it is staying current with the ever-changing nature of the attacks, the type of investigations included in the databases, and the actual sharing of information processes among JTTF members. If you're to be successful in combating terrorism, law enforcement, cities and towns, and our government must be communicating, sharing information, improving intelligence, and coordinating our prevention and response efforts. In 2013, following the bombings at the Boston Marathon, federal agents worked side by side with local law enforcement officers, collecting evidence at the finish line, interviewing witnesses and suspects, combing through petabytes of data from cellular service providers, and poring over the all-important collection of images from fixed surveillance and civilian cameras. The decision to crowdsource, to go to the Internet for help from citizens for potential evidence, was made jointly by federal, state, and local authorities. This collaboration, both in the field and behind the scenes, resulted in both suspects being arrested or killed within 102 hours. Communities have a vital role in the prevention of attacks. I've investigated transnational organized crime throughout the majority of my career. I can tell you that after 35 years of policing, criminals or bad actors are always a small percentage of the population they live within. It is impossible to work these cases without building strong, cooperative, and trusting relationships with the many good people within that same population. And that's true whether you're doing narcotics trafficking, human trafficking, or terrorist investigations. Those who are often most vulnerable to the threats of these depraved actors. When I was commissioner at the Boston Police Department, we hosted and participated in the Bridges Group. It's a collaborative effort among various community representatives, federal, state, and local government agencies, and it's designed to enhance safety and security and provide an opportunity for candid conversation. At that time, the Boston Police Department was experiencing an uptick in violence involving young Somali men. The Somali group representatives that participated in the Bridges meeting stepped in. They remediated the situation through community council, activities, and job creation in coordination with the Boston Police Department, and that problem went away. The communities of every city and town across the United States have the ability to play a central role in the prevention of organized and lone wolf attacks. Citizens can, if properly informed and trusting, provide early information to law enforcement agencies on radicalization in their midst. One of the marathon bombers, Tamerlan Tsarnaev, had a concerning outburst indicative of potential radicalization at the Cambridge Mosque prior to the attacks. No information regarding the incident was provided to federal, state, or local authorities. This was a missed opportunity to intervene. It would have led to greater scrutiny of the Tsarnaevs before the bombs exploded. This requires, however, consistent effort to build trust and strong relationships. Intelligence sharing has been improved through the fusion centers located across the country. More effective JTTFs and improved technology. One of the best practices in Boston is a comprehensive review of the JTTF cases. This is done several times a year and always prior to a major event. This process has provided more focused follow-up on individuals who've posed the greatest threat to citizens. I have more written testimony, but I don't want to go over my time here. So I will sum up by saying that by working together, by training, preparing, and planning for these events, and most importantly, by developing the intelligence needed to intervene, like we saw in the attack on the police in Boston a year ago, where a terrorist was being monitored and said he was going to go kill a police officer and behead a police officer. There was immediate intervention that occurred that stopped that attack from happening. That makes all the difference. Thank you.
Commissioner. Our next witness is Tom Jocelyn, who also has appeared before this committee a number of times. Mr. Jocelyn is a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and a senior editor of its Long War Journal, a widely read publication tracking counterterrorism operations and terror threats. Much of his research focuses on how al-Qaeda and ISIS operate around the globe. He served as a trainer for the FBI's Counterterrorism Division and is a very regular face in the halls of Congress, having testified more than a dozen times. Mr. Jocelyn, you're recognized for your testimony, and thanks for being back.
No, thank you, Congressman, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here today. Unfortunately, I've had to testify more than a dozen times. As I say often to my wife, this has been somewhat of a growth industry over the years. I wish it wasn't. I would very much like to go back in economics and finance at any time, but I find myself here again. The truth of the matter is, I'll start, in my written testimony, I sort of look at different levels of threats to domestic security. One of the levels of threat is sort of what we call inspired attacks or something along those lines, where often called lone wolves. I don't term them that way. I term them as individual terrorists or individual attackers, because if they're responding to a global ideological movement and are taking up that call, then in fact they actually at least have an ideological bond to the people who are trying to attack us and to professional organizations. But beyond that, if you look at my written testimony, I include somewhere between 8 and 10 or 11 examples of a different phenomenon that ISIS has taken to another level inside Europe and the U.S., and it's this phenomenon called remote-controlled attacks. And this is something they've had some success. These are small-scale operations. These are operations where a digital handler, a virtual handler for ISIS, sits in Raqqa, Syria, or somewhere outside of Mosul, Iraq, and via social media applications is able to communicate with would-be recruits in the West or elsewhere. And they've done this around the globe. And Congressman King, I'd like to point that one of the examples in my testimony actually involves a would-be jihadi in Queens, who was in touch with an ISIS handler overseas in Syria and was getting instructions on how to carry out an attack in New York City. This is a different level than just the sort of so-called inspired attack. These are a whole new ball game, really, in terms of counterterrorism. The level of it is, anyway. And in that regard, the FBI has, on a number of occasions, shut down such operations. If you go through the public record and courts of law, you'll see that on numerous occasions they have confidential informants and those sorts of people sort of well-placed to disrupt these plots. In some cases, the guys who are on the other end of the remote control attacks here in the U.S. really are just sort of doofuses, to be honest with you, who aren't really all that menacing, I don't think. But in some cases, they are. In some cases, they are a problem. And so this is a new sort of phenomenon that the FBI over the last couple of years has been dealing with very carefully. And there is some controversy over some of the FBI's tactics. I think that's something that should be actually debated publicly in some of these cases. Beyond that, beyond looking at that sort of the individual attackers or the lone attackers, the risk of a professional attack is still out there. When we're talking about well-trained terrorists who are dispatched. And Congressman, at the beginning of the hearing, you said rightly that we haven't suffered another 9/11 scale style attack in the U.S., and we can all be, of course, thankful for that. I think what's often lost in the discourse in the U.S. and elsewhere is that that's not by any accident, and it's not because the threat has totally disappeared or is gone, but is instead the result of military intelligence and law enforcement work that is constantly trying to shut down these threats. And what we do at the Lone War Journal is monitor this. Every day there's a story about somebody who's being targeted in counterterrorism operations overseas who may or may not be involved in plotting against the West. And in that vein, we all recognize to a certain extent the threat of ISIS poses and what they want to do in the West, what they did in November 2015 in Paris, what they would like to do elsewhere. But al-Qaeda is still very much in the game. And there's been a lot of, I would say, erroneous assessments of al-Qaeda's strength that have floated out there. And I'm just going to give you a couple data points on that very quickly. In October 2015, the U.S. military, along with its Afghan allies, raided what is probably the largest al-Qaeda training camp in history in Afghanistan, in the Shorabak district of Kandahar. It was approximately 30 square miles in size. It didn't have any propaganda coming out of there. They didn't want you to know they were there, but they were training a lot of recruits. And this speaks to the fact that the al-Qaeda threat in Afghanistan and Pakistan remains there. And I'll give you another data point on that. In December 2016, the U.S. military came out and said that they had killed or captured 250 al-Qaeda operatives in Afghanistan throughout the calendar year 2016. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually 2.5 times the high-end estimate that the Obama administration had pushed since 2010 on the number of al-Qaeda operatives in all of Afghanistan. The U.S. military also says that they are hunting al-Qaeda operatives in 7 provinces in Afghanistan right now. Okay? On top of that, General Nicholson, who runs the NATO Operations Resolute Support and in charge of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, recently gave an interview in which he said there are plots against the U.S. homeland Afghanistan right now that we are trying to counter. And in October of last year, one of the chief al-Qaeda operatives responsible for that was killed, a guy named Farouk al-Qahtani. He was a made man within al-Qaeda circles for many, many years. That was one of his jobs, in addition to fighting the insurgency in Afghanistan and supporting Taliban operations, was to try and plot attacks against the U.S. On top of that, in January 20th this year, Inauguration Day, the Defense Department came out and said that they had killed 150 al-Qaeda terrorists since January 1st, so just in the first 19 days of January, in Syria. And in fact, they were forced to attack a large al-Qaeda training camp that had been in operation since 2013. We track these operations in Syria and elsewhere. To give you a sense of what's going on in the world, we are still killing guys who joined the jihad in 1979 or 1980 or 1981, who are still in the game and are still serving al-Qaeda's cause this many years later. If you don't think that they haven't thought about their replacements or have had plenty of time to groom the replacements, well, then I think we're missing part of the story. And these guys have been operating for a long, long time. And of course, I'll leave you one last anecdote on this. Last summer, Brett McGurk, who leads the anti-ISIL coalition, came out in his testimony before the Senate, and he said that, in fact, al-Qaeda had raised its largest affiliate in history in Syria, answering directly to Ayman al-Zawahiri. There's no doubt in my mind that al-Qaeda heard that. They heard other similar statements that started coming out of the Obama administration and decided to change their name and pretend that they weren't al-Qaeda anymore. This is their famous game. They do this all over the globe. But that speaks to the fact, this is something that we warned about in Long War Journal and in these hearings, Congressman, and elsewhere. They were grooming this huge paramilitary force in Syria. It's very easy for them to redeploy or carve off some part of that to try and attack, plot in the West. They have many obstacles to executing a successful attack in the West, many, okay? There's no guaranteed assurance that they can actually do this, but the threat is still there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jocelyn. Excuse me. Our next witness is Robin Simcox. Mr. Simcox specializes in terrorism and national security analysis as the Margaret Thatcher Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Prior to joining Heritage last year, he was a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, a foreign policy think tank in London, and he also has testified several times before this committee on terror threats and radicalization. His work has been published in multiple newspapers and magazines, including the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Atlantic, West Point's Counterterrorism, Sentinel, and the Weekly Standard. Mr. Simcox received a Master of Science degree in U.S. Foreign Policy from the Institute for the Study of the Americas, University of London, and a Bachelor of Arts degree in International History from the University of Leeds. And originally from England, he currently resides in Washington, D.C. It's good to have you back, and you're recognized for your testimony.
Thank you. Chairman King and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. My goal is to highlight just some of the issues which have hindered U.S. counterterrorism efforts in recent years. Allow me to suggest 3 specific areas to which the U.S. could devote more attention. The first area lies in defining the enemy. The U.S. dedicates a huge amount of resources to counterterrorism, yet U.S. policymakers, and arguably us as a society, seem to be no closer to a consensus on where the source of this terrorist threat emerges from and who exactly our real adversaries are. President Trump refers to the enemy as radical Islamic terrorism. If this is the lexicon to be used, then serious thought needs to be given to what constitutes a radical Islamic terrorist. I'm sure we can all agree that it includes al-Qaeda and ISIS. Yet al-Qaeda and ISIS are manifestations of a broader Islamist movement. The ideology that propels these groups transcends the tens of thousands of their fighters that the US is most fixated upon in the short term. So are we just focused on those willing to use violence to achieve their goals, or should our ambitions be grander? For example, there's currently a discussion over whether to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. Yet whether the US does so or not cannot deflect from the broader questions that must be answered, such as, are we aiming to defeat or discredit all forms of political Islam? If so, how do we reconcile this aim with broader diplomatic goals? After all, not so long ago, the Brotherhood came to power in Tunisia and Egypt. So do we need different strategies to deal with Islamism at home and abroad? What about those Salafists whose ideology we may find harmful and socially divisive, but who say they are non-political? I don't think a lot of serious thought has gone into some of these questions over recent years, and I think it might be worthwhile beginning to do so. The second area lies with the Countering Violent Extremism, CVE, initiative. According to the Department for Homeland Security, CVE aims to address the root causes of violent extremism by providing resources to communities to build and sustain local prevention efforts and promote the use of counter-narratives to confront violent extremist messaging online. CVE should not be dismissed out of hand, but it should also be limited in scope, and the US must develop robust ways of measuring the success of its initiatives. Otherwise, there is a possibility that the US makes the same mistakes some of its allies have made with such programs. Let me provide an example of this from the UK. So clearly it is only Muslims who have the knowledge and credibility within their communities to tackle Islamist extremism most effectively. Yet CVE partners should also be supportive of some very basic principles, such as a belief in democracy, religious freedom, equality, and freedom of speech. In the UK, this was not the case. Too much trust was placed in certain groups claiming to be representative of British Muslim opinion, yet organisationally and ideologically tied to Islamist groups in South Asia and North Africa. Such groups did not adhere to basic British values. Yet they gained the ear of the government and worked to shut down conversation about any ideological and theological roots of terrorism, and instead pushed an agenda that placed acts of terrorism solely at the door of US and UK foreign policy. The legacy of this continues to hamper UK policy in this area today, and I fear a similar thing could happen in the US. The third area lies with encouraging reform from key international partners. ISIS would clearly like to carry out a terrorist attack in the US. So far, however, there are no known cases of ISIS operatives being able to infiltrate the US from abroad and then commit such an attack. This is not the case in Europe, however, where ISIS has had far more success. This has a clear relevance to the US. Approximately over 1.5 million American citizens live in Europe, and that's not even counting all those who live on military bases. Americans have already been killed in terrorist attacks in Paris in November 2015, Brussels in March 2016, and Nice in July 2016. Unfortunately, European countries that are threatened by ISIS usually do not have sufficiently robust counter-terrorism defences in place. Therefore, the US must do what it can to protect its citizens by encouraging certain European partners to spend more money on counter-terrorism efforts, reform their complex intelligence apparatuses, and to take a more robust approach to law and order and border security. These are just some of the challenges US security policy must address. Yet by working with its allies abroad, a multi-pronged and nuanced approach to the threat at home, and a clearer understanding of the ideology that threatens the US, some headway can be made. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Mr. Simcox. Our final witness is Peter Bergen, who has also appeared before this committee, and certainly both this committee and the Intelligence Committee, where I also serve. We've seen him a number of times. He's a Vice President and Director of the Fellows Program, the International Security Program at New America in D.C., a Professor of Practice at the School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University, where he is the Co-Director of the Center on the Future of War. He's a CNN National Security Analyst and a Fellow at Fordham University's Center on National Security. He's a prolific author, authoring 5 books on terrorism and homeland security. We probably agree more often than not, but even when we don't agree, I have the greatest respect for your integrity and your intellect. So, Mr. Bergen, with that, it's great to have you back before the committee.
Thank you, Chairman King. Thank you, Ranking Member Rice and the other distinguished members of the committee. I don't want to sort of repeat what's already been said, so focusing perhaps more on what we can do or what we shouldn't do. So 2 things we shouldn't do. The visa ban. The visa ban is a temporary ban from the 7 Muslim majority countries, is totally ineffective if you look at what has actually happened since 9/11. As it's presently constructed, it would be a bit like saying we have a problem with gangs from Central America that have roots in Salvador, and therefore we should stop people from Argentina, Chile, and Canada coming into the United States. It doesn't make any sense, because of the 94 Americans that have been killed by terrorists since 9/11, according to research conducted by New America, and my team is here with me. None of these attacks were conducted by the 7 Muslim majority country nationals, and none of their families came from these countries. And so there seems to be a campaign promise that hasn't really been thought through very carefully. And let's see what happens tomorrow as they move the goalposts on this. But the real issue is Americans radicalizing here in this country, and they're radicalizing because of what they're reading online. Of the 117 people, Americans who've traveled to Syria to join ISIS or other groups, 88 of them were heavy users of the internet, not just sending emails, but posting jihadist material. Sometimes, as other people testifying here have said, communicating directly with ISIS. Now, the internet is not subject to a visa ban. So the issue is really a question of how to deal with that problem. The people, Americans radicalizing here. A second bad idea, which Mr. Sincox has sort of gestured at, is the idea of banning the Muslim, or designating the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. This would be very stupid. This would be akin to saying, because everybody in this country who attacks an abortion clinic is a Christian fundamentalist, we should designate Christian fundamentalists as terrorists. This makes no sense. The Muslim Brotherhood is a movement of tens of millions of people, a tiny minority of whom have then gone on to join Al-Qaeda. The Muslim Brotherhood is important members of close American allies in the government, in Jordan, in Kuwait, in Tunisia, in Iraq, people that we need to work with us. Okay, so an idea that would work is an idea actually proposed by Chairman King, which is the no-fly, no-buy idea. Now, it is astonishing that Major Nadal Hassan, who killed 13 people at Fort Hood, Omar Mateen, who killed 49 people in Orlando, and Carlos Bledsoe, who killed an American soldier in Little Rock, Arkansas in 2009, legally purchased semi-automatic weapons despite the fact that they were the subjects of FBI scrutiny. And the NRA has put up a huge smokescreen about this issue, saying, well, some people on the no-fly list shouldn't be there. Well, that's ridiculous, because there are 81,000 people on the no-fly list, only 800 of whom are Americans. And maybe one of them shouldn't be on the list. But the idea that there's sort of a problem with this is crazy. Another idea is we should stay in Afghanistan. I think one of the more counterproductive things the Obama administration did was say we're constantly withdrawing. We're not going to withdraw from Afghanistan, in my lifetime, I think, and it's right for the United States security. It's right for security for other countries around the world and for Afghans. They want us to stay. So I hope that the administration has a robust policy in Afghanistan. It's not about the number of troops, it's about the political messaging around it. Afghans don't care if it's 8,400 troops as we have now or 12,000. From a purely military point of view, there's a difference, but it's the political messaging. We have a strategic partnership with Afghanistan till 2024. Let's stay there. Let's say we're going to stay there till we can really eliminate some of the threats that Mr. Jocelyn talked about. Something that is working is micro-targeting. Now, if I look for shoes online, for the rest of my life, I'm going to get advertisements about shoes online. And I think the GEC at state has actually moved to a much better policy, which is we're going to micro-target people looking for ISIS propaganda. We're going to have counter messages in local languages. Google is doing some of this too. This is actually something that at least does no harm and may actually work. I think it was very useful that we talked about the attacks on Jewish targets, because of the 94 Americans have been killed by jihadi terrorists since 9/11, 50 have been killed by extreme right-wing militants, including a number at, for instance, in Kansas City in 2014 by a neo-Nazi. Also, we had the incident at the Holocaust Museum here in Washington. And also, we also have now a black separatist militant who's killed 5 people. And in an era of increasing polarization, we shouldn't be completely fixated on jihadi terrorism. Look, just here in this city, on December 5th, we, I think, missed, something could have been very serious, a Comet Pizza, where a man armed with a semi-automatic weapon came into the pizza restaurant and was planning to do violence. Luckily, he was disabled before he could do anything. Finally, picking up on what Commissioner Davis said, enlisting the Muslim community is the right approach, because the FBI has done a very interesting study of 80 terrorism cases since 2009, and the study may be larger by now. But what they found was the people who know the most about a potential attack are peers. And the people who know the second most are family members, then next authority figures like clerics or teachers. Finally, strangers know the least. The people most likely to drop a dime are strangers, but they have the least useful information. And so we see in the Orlando case that Enrique Marquez, in the San Bernardino case, that Enrique Marquez actually knew a lot about what was going to happen. Unfortunately, he didn't say anything. So we really want to get those people to come forward. Just 2 other quick points. I'm very concerned about the insider threat from airports, which is something this committee should, I'm sure is concerned about too. Sinai shows that this is the one way they can get their holy grail. And there are 103 countries that have direct flights to the United States. Now, if you're taking a direct flight from Heathrow, that's probably less of a problem than, let's say, from some other countries. But I think this is a real area. And the final issue that I would like to focus on is the question of armed drones. Hezbollah and ISIS have all used armed drones in combat. And there's a vast proliferation. American embassies overseas are well protected against truck bombs. Are they well protected against armed drones?
Thank you, Mr. Bergen. Commissioner Davis, if I could start. I've discussed the discussed this with Director Comey. We had the cases in Orlando, the case in California, where the FBI had been carrying out investigations, and then they closed the investigation when nothing was found. And I'm not being critical of the FBI for not finding it. Just by the nature of the people they're investigating, you may not find it in 4 months or 6 months or whatever the time limit happens to be. Do you have any suggestions as to how either the FBI can continue the investigation or somehow ensure that the local police are fully briefed and they carry out continue at least some surveillance and some investigation and then report back to the FBI or work with the FBI? Microphone.
Thank you, Chairman. 2 points on that issue. The first would be to follow the lead of what the Boston Police Department is doing right now, which is a multi-time, each year, there are multiple scrubs of all of the information in the Guardian database. Whenever there's an event coming up, in preparation for that event, there's a team sent in to work with the JTTF to go through the database to see who's out there and who might pose a threat. And then there's a joint meeting on what we could do to stop that from happening. That is a best practice that should happen nationwide. The other thing is, and this is more an organizational issue. I've worked in big police departments. I've run big organizations. Since I've stepped down, I've worked with some of the biggest corporations in the United States, 50,000 employees, 100,000 employees all across the globe. Those companies can't get things done unless they're continually reviewing their policies to make sure their policies are being carried out. So as I said in my testimony, a review of those agreements and a real check to make sure that the organization hasn't snapped back to old practices. You can pull it, when you have an organization and you're going to change that organization, that rubber band can stretch so far, but then it snaps back sometimes. And it's usually in the middle of the organization, the mid-level managers that are responsible for that. The well-intentioned leaders of the organization want to see the right thing happen. If you're not continually reviewing that process, you can have that snapback effect. And I think that's what we have to guard against here in the United States.
Thank you. Also, if I get Ed, you mentioned about working with the local Muslim communities. I know of several instances, for instance, in Suffolk County in New York, where the police have very close relationships, including monthly meetings at the mosque with the imam. And yet in several of those mosques, you had members of the mosque who were arrested overseas or arrested here in the U.S. for being involved in terrorist plots. And in several of those I'm aware of, the police said, well, why didn't you tell us about them? In fact, when Venus is one, he was arrested in Afghanistan, and he was planning an attack on the Long Island Railroad. And the imam proudly said, well, he came to our mosque, and we told him we don't do jihad here. But he never told the police when they were coming in to warn them about Venus. And there were 2 others also from the South Shore with similar type instances. What has your experience been as far as getting cooperation? Also, you mentioned the Somalis. I know this goes back several years, but we had testimony before our committee that when a young man was killed in Somalia, a man from Minneapolis was killed in Somalia, they basically, the local leaders told the people not to cooperate with the FBI. And that was going back several years. Do you know if those situations have improved?
Well, there's no question, Chairman, that that there are going to be problems. This is not a perfect solution to the issue. It's just one of many things that has to be continued to play out. In the example I used, where we had the Bridges Group, the main deficiency with the Bridges Group was only bringing people in that were very friendly to us. So we had the same people coming in from 9/11 up until 2013, and we got to know them very well, and they were friends. We never expanded beyond that group into the more radical mosques, doing outreach to places where we knew were problematic. That's really, I think, the key to this, is to establish trust. But even if you do establish trust, there's still going to be very sophisticated actors in these groups that don't divulge their plans. That's when you have to pay attention to the surveillance part of it, and to work these cases as if they're sophisticated and you know, bad-intentioned criminals and actors from foreign places that are attempting to hurt us. So a combination of surveillance and outreach, I think, is the answer to it.
Also, I think it was mentioned that we've only had, in fact, I mentioned in my opening statement how there has not been a large-scale attack, but it has been good police and good FBI work that stopped them. For instance, the 2009 attempted subway attack in New York, if that had succeeded, at least hundreds, maybe thousands of people could have been killed where that was launched. So in many ways, these numbers aren't always apples and oranges. They are apples and oranges because there could be many more thousands killed if it had not been for the extensive surveillance that was being carried out.
There's no question, and the success has been across the boards. Local, state, and federal agencies have stopped these events from happening. One of the problems that my contacts in the world of anti-terrorism work mentioned is the large number of people with psychological problems that are bubbling up and end up being reported to JTTFs, and the lack of sort of a way to deal with somebody who's just got a psych problem and mentions terrorism, as opposed to someone who actually is intent on hurting the United States. And Mr. Jocelyn mentioned it in his testimony, some sort of middle of the line way to deal with people who are presenting with serious psych problems and could do something bad, but most likely need some type of supervision or treatment. That's a huge problem for JTTFs across the country.
Thank you. Recognize the ranking member for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bergen, I'd like to go to you because I think that some of the things that you were touching on are addressing the issue that we're facing in this country. And I'm sure it happens in every change of administration. I'm not specifically saying that this has anything to do with the fact that it's Donald Trump as our president now. But rhetoric and what you say matters. And trying to make a transition from a very heated campaign season to actually governing in the space of national security. I'd just like to ask you if you could talk more about the Muslim Brotherhood and how you think this administration should deal with that group. I'd like you to talk more about the no-fly, no-buy. I give Chairman King a lot of credit for being a patriot before being a politician and introducing that bill in the last Congress. Hopefully it will be reintroduced without any political fanfare, just recognizing the great value of it, and I commend him for that. But if you could just talk more about how, you know, the terminology of radical Islamic terrorism, what is that doing to help hurt the relationships we have to have with all the other Muslim countries that have been our partner in this fight against terrorism, and what can we do to help that situation as members of Congress?
Thank you. You know, I think the discussion of terminology can be less important than sometimes it's seen in this town. So, I mean, that's just my personal view. You know, we don't want to confuse. I mean, you know, if the reporting about H.R. McMaster is true, he told the NSC on Thursday, you know, that he was not in favor of using this term. And clearly, whether it's in Iraq or Afghanistan, our key allies are Muslims. So we don't want to confuse them with the idea that somehow we're at war with Islam. That's just a fact. But our actions are much more important than what we say. And you know, we've inflicted a huge amount of damage on ISIS already. I think the latest figure, about 60,000 ISIS fighters have been killed. So whether we call it radical Islamic terrorism or you know, violent extremists, whatever we call them, we're actually, ISIS is in, you know, grave danger right now of losing its most important city, Mosul. So actions are the key. And so going to your questions, Representative Rice, I mean, the no-fly, no-buy, think about Major Nidal Hassan. He's an Army major. He's not a common criminal. He had to buy 4 semi-automatic weapons to kill 13 people at Fort Hood. He couldn't go on the street and, you know, very unlikely to buy one as a, you know, from a criminal. He didn't know any criminals. So, of course, it's not a perfect solution that if you're on the no-fly list, you can't buy a semi-automatic weapon but it is better than many of the other things that have been proposed. It would actually make a difference. Similarly, with the Muslim Brotherhood, I mean, the largest Arab country is Egypt with 80 million people. Until very recently, their government was the Muslim Brotherhood. They were democratically elected, unlike so many of the other regimes around the region. So this idea of designating them as a terrorist organization is simply ridiculous.
Commissioner Davis, just to talk more, because I actually think that what you did after the bombing in terms of reaching out to the community is incredibly valuable as opposed to bringing people in instead of shunning them. Can you just talk more about how much of your time is spent, you know, because I know that there's some resistance on the part of law enforcement. People want to be more aggressive in certain communities and shut them out and focus on them in a different way than a community policing model would allow for. So if you could just talk more about the value of bringing people in, and going into these communities and trying to get information from them and let them know that we're trying to work together, or however your philosophy, whatever that was.
Right. Thank you, Ranking Member. I policed urban areas, and there are enclaves of people who live in urban areas, depending on where you go in the city. And many times, these individuals need our help more than anybody else. And so it's important for us as a police organization to establish trust across the city so that when someone is in trouble and they need assistance, they're not afraid to call us. And we spend a lot of time doing that when I was the commissioner in Boston, and it continues today, and it's been going on for 30 years. That outreach is critical, and that trusting relationship is critical for us to be able to work in these communities and protect the good people who are there. And if we don't do that, then the people who live in these communities will not trust the police, they'll not call us, and the bad guys will be able to run roughshod over their own fellow either citizens or wherever region they're from in these small neighborhoods. It is crucial that we maintain close relationships. That's, as Mr. Bergen said, it's much more likely for a peer to report this bad activity than it is for someone just at the mosque, or it's going to be someone who they know and they work with. And so, and this is true. I've worked narcotics cases for much of my career. If we weren't talking to people from the countries, the source countries of narcotics, we would never be able to put a case together against the criminals who are actually transporting the narcotics into the country. The same applies to terrorism.
Thank you very much.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 2008, the Holy Land Foundation and several of its senior leaders were convicted of funneling more than $12 million to Hamas, with the jury finding the defendants guilty on all counts of the indictment. While the Holy Land Foundation was brought to justice, the Obama administration refused to investigate the list of 246 unindicted co-conspirators presented as evidence by the prosecution. On February 17th of this year, my colleagues and I authored a letter asking Attorney General Sessions to reopen the investigation into the unindicted co-conspirators listed in the largest terrorist financing trial in our nation's history, which is the United States versus the Holy Land Foundation for Relief and Development et al. At this time, I ask unanimous consent that this be submitted for the record.
Without objection.
So I think my first question will go to Mr. Jocelyn. Wahhabi ideology is essentially the wellspring of the doctrine and worldviews of radical Islamic terrorist organizations, or Islamism, or fundamentalism, or whatever you folks feel comfortable with calling it, in general, and of ISIS in particular. I know you're often focused on al-Qaeda, but I know that you're well-versed in ISIS as well, and the general theme. Many of ISIS's official publications are classic works of the Wahhabi canon, and ISIS ideologues and supporters regularly liken the so-called caliphate to the first Saudi Wahhabi state. Since 1979, Saudi Arabia has engaged in a persistent and consistent campaign of exporting Wahhabi ideology throughout the Muslim world, spending about $4 billion annually on mosques, madrasas, preachers, students, and textbooks. Wahhabi ideology has become so prominent in the Muslim world that by 2013, 75% of North American Islamic centers relied on Wahhabi preachers who promote anti-Western ideas in person and online through their sermons and through the Saudi-produced literature. So the question is, what role does the export of Wahhabism by Saudi Arabia play in the radicalization of Muslims, whether it be in regard to ISIS, al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, or otherwise, both at home and abroad, and in grooming them for recruitment by terrorist organizations?
Well, Wahhabi extremism is an issue in a lot of ways. I mean, in the areas where the funding goes to fund those mosques or madrasas, it oftentimes runs roughshod over local Islamic traditions, basically replaced by this extremist version of Islam. But in terms of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, we also have to be careful a little bit, where ISIS in particular has basically draws on ideas outside of the Wahhabi realm quite often, and has actually turned its rhetorical guns and is trying to turn its literal guns on the Saudi kingdom on a regular basis. Same thing with Al-Qaeda. I mean, you know, part of why the Saudis have intervened in Yemen, for example, is they were worried both about the Houthi rebellion there and also on the Al-Qaeda side. So there is a story to be told on Saudi funding of extremism for sure. I think it's a problem. It's not the version of Islam that I think most Muslims around the world are used to or know. It's not part of the regular customs. And I've seen complaints everywhere from Nigeria through North Africa, through East Africa, all the way into South Asia, of where when the Saudis turn on the spigot, basically a very different version of sort of Islam shows up. And I think it's very careful. We should be very careful about tracking that and understanding that. To your point about the terrorism finance, Congressman, I would second the idea that any specific violations of terrorist finance laws need to be investigated and prosecuted here in the U.S. I think I'm aware that there's been a slow roll on that issue. And the way I think about the world is in terms of very specific threats and very specific ties to terrorists. And if there are organizations here in the U.S. which are engaging in that sort of fundraising activity, once again, they should be investigated and prosecuted.
So just kind of following up on your discussion about most Muslims, and I would agree with you that most Muslims eschew or reject the Wahhabi or the strict structural, fundamental form of Wahhabism that is put upon them. But I still am concerned about oftentimes the high percentage of Muslims worldwide, and most peaceful Muslims. Let's just be clear here; they're the ones that are put upon by this ideology and most of the reign of terror, if you will, by the Wahhabists or Islamists. But many of the world's Muslim population, and including the United States, sees Sharia, which is oftentimes as well associated with Wahhabism, is perfectly okay and appropriate to live under. And so in a circumstance where many of the occupants might not like the kind of the outcome of living under those circumstances, they don't really disagree with it fundamentally when questioned. What do you make of that?
Well, as a secular humanist, I'm certainly no fan of Sharia law. But I'll say this, Sharia means different things within the Muslim community. There isn't one interpretation or meaning of that, and that's not a cop-out or apologia for it. Really, Sharia can mean a number of different things. What I think you're concerned about, or what I'd be concerned about, are organizations that basically say that Sharia law should supplant sort of American customs or American ideas and principles. And I think that's something that needs to be contested in the court of public opinion and exposed and sort of debated, is basically the way I would handle that more often than not. I don't think, just because an individual Muslim necessarily adheres to Sharia, it may not mean the version of Sharia that is sort of totalitarian or sort of wants to supplant American customs. It may mean something much more local and personal. I certainly know, Muslims in the New York, New Jersey area who will tell you they're Sharia compliant, and yet they don't believe in Muslim Brotherhood ideology or, Al-Qaeda's ideology or ISIS or anything like that. So what I would look at is basically organizations that sort of advocate a version of that is sort of totalitarian in nature and contest it in the court of public opinion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just quickly, you can just say yes if you agree with this, but is the #1 threat to the citizens of this country still homegrown, violent extremist people here? Would you say this about the major threat that we have?
I believe it is right now.
Mr. Jocelyn?
I think it's a major threat with one caveat, which you'll see in my testimony, which is if eventually they're successful in infiltrating a team into U.S. soil. But it is the predominant threat on a day-to-day basis.
Simcox?
Yes, I think the most numerous amount of homegrown, although what we've seen in Europe is that the highest body count can often come from when external planners are involved.
Ms. Bergen?
Yes.
Okay. I was really pleased, Commissioner Davis, to hear your views on the progress that we made, and thank you for your work with this committee on dealing with in the aftermath of the Boston Marathon bombing, the lessons learned, and the fact that we are sharing information and the legislation that requires the codification of that so it doesn't get lost as people come and go through different agencies. I just wanted to touch base on one aspect that you may or not, all of you might feel, particularly Commissioner Davis since he's been there. I think the area where there's a great deal of stress on our officials trying to counter terrorism in this country is at that guardian and at the assessment stage, because I think the volume is so high on the FBI as they go through that. Their resources are strained. It's very difficult, and there's a timeline they have to work with. And afterwards, you know, there's what we used to call, you know, closing the book on everything, so that information not shared. I believe that the same progress we've made sharing information could be greater utilized at that assessment stage, working with people. I looked at the New Jersey and New York bombings, and, you know, from what was public in that information, I thought at that stage, greater participation at the local level could have been better, and I think that's a case elsewhere. How can we accomplish that to a better degree?
Well, I think that the rules and regulations that the FBI operate under are extremely difficult to follow. I've looked at them, and I know in my sort of experience of investigating cases, they're overly bureaucratic, and I think maybe a review of that would be in order. So I think that's sort of the first step. But I'll agree with you that groupthink on these situations results in a much better outcome, and also eliminates the potential for criticism and review afterwards.
Yeah, and I think it helps deal with the problem you referenced that I think is a very major problem. People with psychological difficulties, trying to screen out where there's a real problem. I think people at the local level have more insight into that. So beyond the rules and regulations, is it a force multiplier? Do you know, I know you don't want to comment on if we need more resources for the FBI. I happen to think they could use more in that regard. But that's a critical area that I think we could improve things.
I think so too, and I think that coming together on these cases, deciding how to vet the real threats from these psychological,
taking it to beyond information sharing into more joint reviews of that. Thank you. A quick question, Mr. Bergen. You mentioned that the executive order didn't help things, basically, didn't achieve anything. You didn't get into the fact, can it hinder our efforts? I didn't think you did.
Yeah, I just don't know.
Yeah. Anyone have any thoughts on that? Or there was reports that the CVE funding that was there were turned down by certain groups after the executive order. That's what made me think, is that a problem there?
Actually, let me revise. You know, the Iraqi government is really angry about this ban, and clearly, you know, who's dying in Iraq, in Mosul, it's overwhelmingly Iraqi. So, you know, we managed to really anger one of our key allies with this ban.
Good. Any other questions about how we can improve some of the activities through the CVE? How is that working? Are there more funds necessary? Are they effective? I know in Boston and New York they've used those funds a great deal.
right? We have, and as I said in my comments earlier, outreach is extremely important. Identifying what's happening, but also, you know, saying what this really is, and identifying precisely what the threat is, who's responsible for it, and making sure that we have a clear idea, as Robin said in his testimony, is as important as the outreach. This has to be a balanced approach.
Good. I'll have more follow-up questions in writing, since my time's expired, on airport issues and the airline issues, which I think that we've made great progress but still remain threats in her. So I'll save that for my written portion since my time is out, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, thank you very much. I'm delighted to join you this morning. Thank you to all the witnesses. And Chief Davis, you've got Mr. Davis in front of Davis. You've got Mr., but I can't help but, again, to acknowledge your great leadership. You're a very fine congressperson, was such a champion for Boston, but you were certainly the gleaming example of what we hoped tragically would come out of Homeland Security when there was a tragedy. We hope you wouldn't have to encounter, but the collaboration, the local leadership, the insisting on the sharing of intelligence, you did it all, and we are grateful for you. I think that is the way that we put forward the best domestic front in protecting the people and protecting the homeland, so I thank you for that. To all of the witnesses as well, we appreciate you being here. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to introduce into the record two articles. One, hate crime is feared as 2 Indian engineers are shot in Kansas. Ask unanimous consent to introduce into the record.
Objection.
The second is a 1,094 bias-related incidents in the month following the election. Ask unanimous consent.
Without objection.
I also would like to pose a question, Mr. Chairman. I will put it in writing, but I would ask that this committee, being the frontline committee on intelligence, be part of the investigation that would determine what questions were posed to the Department of Homeland Security and DOJ, but our jurisdiction is Homeland Security, in asking, let me just say, I don't know whether the word was demanding, a memorandum that would support the administration's decision on the banning of Muslim countries, 7 Muslim countries. It is reported in the media that the Homeland Security Department was asked to produce the memo to support the actions that were already taken, and I think that's important information for us to have as members of the Homeland Security Committee, and as well for us to do our unfettered work, unfettered investigatory work, and also meeting with the standards of this hearing, the future of counterterrorism, addressing the evolving threat in domestic security. We have to ensure that independence in our agencies. Let me pursue this with Mr. Berger. Thank you for your work. I wouldn't say that I won't use the term fascinated. I was about to say it, but I'm in awe at the initial writing of the executive order and all of its nuances. One of the ones that really struck me was the 120-day ban on refugees. That combines with, I'm from the city of Houston. We have a large number of refugees for decades. We had a huge number of Iraqi refugees that came in after and the war and ongoing. We have a huge number of Afghan refugees. And you just made a very valid point. I've been to Mosul, and I've watched the retaking. I was there in the bloody, let me not characterize, but as a member in the after effect of all the bloodiness that went on in those earlier times. But we know that Mosul has been a site, and here we have Iraqi military forces, with certainly the technical help of our very fine military, moving forward and moving in these ISIS strongholds. This is miraculous and bloody. And so who knows what refugees may come out of that. We know that there are people who are interpreters and otherwise, but would you please answer the question of the far-reaching impact of an executive order impacting refugees, 120 days, possibly in fear of their life, and then just the general statement that the executive order makes in terms of the United States' history of friendship with the Muslim world.
Thank you, Representative Levy. I would point to the indefinite ban of Syrian refugees coming into this country as one of the this is a bad idea. We have accepted 15,000 Syrian refugees. There are 5 million of them. So we've taken 0.2%. The last way you'd want to get into this country as a terrorist is a Syrian refugee. It is the hardest way to get in. It takes 2 years. You give up all your biometric data. It is quite a process. And there is no evidence of any Syrian refugee engaging in any form of terroristic activity. So this was a counterproductive idea. And these people are victims of terrorism. They're the victims of state-sponsored terrorism by Assad and victims of ISIS. And they are overwhelmingly women and children.
Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned Syrian, and the Iraqi and refugees overall are impacted negatively by this, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but this executive order.
Agreed.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the ranking member.
I have some follow-up questions. I'll ask the entire panel. It looks as if we are achieving great success in Mosul. Assuming that success continues in Iraq and Syria, how much of a threat do you think we face in this country from terrorists who are driven out of Iraq and Syria? I'd say the threat to Europe and to the United States, since you will have well-trained terrorists there. Is there going to be a problem with them coming? I'm not, you're putting aside the refugee issue and all. I'm talking about people coming into the country.
So far, we've seen no ISIS-trained militants coming into the United States, and we've only seen 8 people, Americans, returning from Syria. They've trained mostly with other groups. So the problem is going to be in Europe, and there will be a problem. But ISIS is not the problem. It's a symptom of big problems that are not going to be fixed anytime soon. We're going to see a son of ISIS and a grandson of ISIS if there's no political accommodation in Iraq and Syria that produced ISIS in the first place. So we're going to be unfortunately testifying on this subject in the future if we can't solve the Syrian civil war and the Iraqi civil war, none of which is easy to do.
I guess my concern was the immediate one as far as law enforcement and terrorism in this country. How alert do we have to be to an increase, a possible increase or upsurge in terrorists coming from either to Europe or to the U.S.?
I think it's particularly Europe. I mean, most of the Americans who've gone, the very few Americans that succeeded getting to Syria, a lot of them have been killed over there. The volume of Europeans is 6,900, I think, in total. The number of Americans who've even got to Syria is maybe 50. Half of whom are probably dead by now. So it's really the European problem, and of course the problem in the Middle East, where there are probably more than 30,000 foreign fighters, not all of whom will get killed. Right. So there will be this bleed out problem.
Mr. Simcox?
Yeah, I think the European foreign fighter issue is a very serious one for the US. These foreign fighters, of course, some of them are going to be killed in trying to defend Raqqa and Mosul and other ISIS strongholds, but many will return to their countries of origin. And this obviously presents a severe threat for Europeans and, of course, Americans living in Europe, of which there are over 1.5 million. But you also have to think of the fact that European agencies, European security agencies around some of the countries especially impacted, Germany, Belgium, France, for example, are overwhelmed with the scale of the problem at the moment. And they clearly, and would say themselves, don't know who exactly has left the country and who exactly is going to be coming back in. Obviously, it's a lot easier for returnees, if they're not on the security radar, to travel to the US from Brussels or Paris than it will be to go from Syria and Iraq. So I think you have to also think there is a potential threat to the US from European returnees, not just in Americans abroad, but also in the US homeland itself.
Mr. Jocelyn?
Well, this is why I always come back to al-Qaeda. I, of course, am well-versed in the ISIS threat, but part of the discussion here is that the military, intelligence, and law enforcement of the U.S. has been dealing with potential al-Qaeda threats emanating from Syria for some time now. There's been an uptick in airstrikes that have been deliberately targeting individuals who, according to the Defense Department, who, according to intelligence sources who talk to the press and make official statements, are involved in plotting against the West and specifically against the U.S. Now, yes, it's difficult to get from Syria into the U.S. It's much easier to get into Europe. They have all sorts of logistical problems in pulling off a major sort of attack from there. But that doesn't mean they're not trying. It doesn't mean they're not probing. It doesn't mean that they don't want to eventually. Another factor here is that they have been very, very patient. This is what makes me worried. And that they actually had a stand-down order for al-Qaeda in Syria for a couple years now, where they were laying the groundwork for plots against the West, but they weren't given the green light for it. Basically, it was they were focusing on the war against the Assad regime and building popular support for al-Qaeda's cause in Syria. Very dangerous in the long run. You want to talk about having hearings for the coming future? That's the type of thing we'll have hearings in the coming future. But the point is that, as in Syria, as in elsewhere, a small part of the resources are devoted to anti-Western plotting. So far, we've disrupted, I think the U.S. has disrupted quite a bit of that, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's there.
Commissioner?
I believe that the more successful the military is in depriving these actors of their foreign lands, the more underground that they will go, and they will attack us on two fronts. One, through the Internet, which I think we need to pay close attention to. The radicalization of our own people through the Internet is an extreme problem that needs more robust defenses. And then the other thing is, we can't forget that 9/11 was a very sophisticated plot. Terrorists will follow the path of least resistance in launching their threats. So Europe has a bigger problem than we have, but we cannot discount it here. They will, if they go underground, they will launch attacks against us from foreign lands that we need to be vigilant about. So at the same time that I believe trusting relationships with the people who live here are extremely important, it's also very important to have a good defense at our borders to keep out anybody who's intent on hurting our people.
Thank you. I know I'm over my time, but Mr. Bergen, if I could just engage you on the question of the 7 countries. We could debate the ban separately, but as far as those 7 countries, agreed, there's not been serious attacks in the past from those 7 countries. But again, when the legislation was first passed, I guess in 2015 and 2016, about taking away the visa waiver status of Europeans, and we attempted to determine which countries had the most potential for danger in the future, we agreed on 4 countries, and that was agreed on with the President and the Congress, and that was voted on. And then the administration itself added 3 countries to come to the 7. Now, the Obama administration had the opportunity to add other countries too, but it was the 4 that was agreed on with Congress and the administration, and then the administration added on the 3 as the countries which had the most potential danger, certainly as far as the visa waiver is concerned. And if we mention countries like Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Egypt, we do have much better relationships now with their intelligence agencies than we had on 9/11. While in these other countries, you have Iran, who is an enemy, and you have certainly, and Iraq could be a separate issue, I agree, but the other countries, basically, there is no intelligence agency, there is no intelligence structure. In many ways, they are broken governments. And I think in only 3 of those countries do we even have embassies. So to me, that was the logic that went into those 7. And again, we could discuss the ban itself or the temporary ban separately, but I think that there is a logic to those 7 countries. But I'd appreciate your thoughts, as I always do.
Thank you, Chairman King. You know, I think it was Jeff Flake and Senator Dianne Feinstein who, there is something that makes sense, which is if you are the citizen of a visa waiver country, which is almost invariably a Western country, and you've recently visited Syria and Iraq, yes, you should be the subject of scrutiny, and a number of these other countries. That makes sense. But just saying anybody who comes from these countries is a potential threat, that doesn't make, I mean, to me that makes less sense. And these countries are given a lot of scrutiny already if you're a citizen of these countries coming in to the United States. But so what was sensible was to say if you're a European who's in the past 5 years visited Syria or Iraq, well, you could be on a humanitarian mission, but you could also be joining ISIS. And giving those people extra scrutiny, I think, made a lot of sense. But just saying anybody from these countries is a potential terrorist, I think, is overdoing it.
Okay. We could debate that, but again,
Yeah.
to me, that was the logic.
Yeah.
And they didn't include Saudi Arabia or Pakistan or Egypt or other countries, which maybe they could have. Tom, do you want, Mr. Johnson?
Yeah, just interject real quick. I agree with what Peter said about dealing with specific threats as opposed to just everybody. This isn't a defense of the travel ban. It has to be dealing with specific threats. As I said in my written testimony, most of the refugee crisis is a humanitarian concern, not a counterterrorism concern. But there are counterterrorism concerns there. And just when you go back to sort of the history, until 9/11, we didn't have an Egyptian, Lebanese, Saudis hijack planes and fly them into buildings before 9/11, So the threat was emanating from countries, and these were foreign nationals who went and got trained in Afghanistan and then made their way through the West to come here. This is a very complex sort of situation. It's not something that goes down to just sort of a crude nationality. In terms of the 7 congressmen, to sort of just buttress your point a little bit, there's no doubt in my mind that some of the preeminent threats to the U.S. security are emanating from Syria and Iraq today. Also Yemen, we know AQAP has tried a number of times to launch attacks against us. In Somalia, which is on the ban list, again, I'm not defending the ban list. I think it's crude, but Somalia, there is a threat emanating there. Al-Qaeda has been experimenting with a very small explosive that they can slip onto planes. You heard Peter mention that possibility in one of the airports abroad that they come into the U.S. They've been experimenting with that type of explosive, and they tried that in Somalia with a flight that came through Europe that they wanted or was going to go through Europe. So I think the countries in Libya as well, I think there are clear defined threats for most of these countries. Iran, of course, is the principal gateway for Al-Qaeda to this day. This is another issue that's not really discussed very much, but the Obama administration between July 2011 and July 2016 on numerous occasions said that the core pipeline for Al-Qaeda's operations around the globe, including sending operatives to the West, goes through Iran, and that's, of course, on the list. So the ban to me is clumsy. There are many problems with it, but in terms of understanding where the threats are coming from, at least a number of the countries on this list are rightfully under scrutiny. I think there are other countries as well, but again, most of the people who come from these countries are not terrorists, of course.
Ranking member for as much time as she wants.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bergen, it was recently reported that the president is looking to, in his budget, he is going to be looking to increase military spending, and part of that was going to be paid for by cutting foreign aid. Can you talk about what that would do and how that would affect national security?
The $54 billion that the Trump administration is seeking for the Department of Defense, I mean, probably some of that is justified, but if it's just simply going to buy, you know, things like the F-35 or other pieces of hardware that are highly expensive and not that relevant to the actual wars we're fighting on, I think the Pentagon itself is going to push back on some of this, because after all, it was Secretary Mattis who said, you know, that in 2013 that the State Department was essential. After all, we don't want to go to war. We want to stop wars before they happen. That's the job of the State Department. It's called diplomacy. So zeroing out foreign aid and basically, you know, kind of gutting the State Department, I think in the long term is a terrible idea. And I'm not even certain that the Pentagon necessarily, of course they want money for veterans and other things like that, but I don't think there's a huge demand signal. This seems to be more of a campaign promise that just sort of willy-nilly has been fulfilled without doing a lot of careful consideration about what are we trying to achieve and how do we best try and achieve it, rather than just saying we're just going to increase 10% to the Department of Defense.
Well, I actually think that it was Secretary Mattis, before he became secretary, who said how critical foreign aid is in terms of maintaining calm and peace throughout the countries in areas that are, you know, that are in volatile areas, and that while having a robust military is obviously very important, from a diplomatic standpoint, from a non-interventionist standpoint, military interventionist standpoint, that foreign aid to all of our allies across the globe is critically essential to maintaining that kind of world order. Would you agree with that, Mr. Bergen?
I mean, we spend 1% of our budget is on foreign aid, so as a percentage of the budget is very, very small. And of course, sometimes it's misspent. I mean, we can't pretend otherwise. But the idea that it should be zeroed out doesn't make sense, because sometimes it's misspent.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bergen, in your written testimony, you claimed the New America, which is the organization that you're employed with, right, has collected data on 399 individuals accused of jihadist terrorism-related crimes since 9/11, and the research shows that of the 94 people killed by jihadist terrorists inside the United States since that time, not a single death would have been prevented by the travel ban. Now, to me, this obviously ignores a number of attempted, failed, or less than lethal terror attacks that have been perpetrated by persons from these 7 countries, and I'm just going to name a few here. Somali refugee Abdul Razak Ali Artan went on a jihadi stabbing rampage at Ohio State. An Iraqi refugee, Omar Faraj Sadid al-Hardan, was accused of planning to bomb a local mall in Texas. A Somali refugee named Dahir Adan went on a stabbing spree in a mall in St. Cloud, Minnesota. A Somali refugee was arrested for planning to blow up a Christmas tree lighting ceremony in Oregon in 2010. And an Iraqi refugee bombed a Social Security office in Arizona. And so the question is, would the executive order protecting the nation currently from, well, as proposed, from foreign terrorist entry into the United States, had it been in place prior to these individuals coming, would it have prevented those instances?
Well, also in my testimony, Sarah, as you may have noticed, I mentioned some of these cases, and in the case of the Ohio State attack, he actually came from Pakistan. He was a Somali refugee who went to Pakistan when he was a child. So did his radicalization take place in Pakistan, which is not on the ban? Did his radicalization take here in the United States? I mean, it raises the broader issue of when children come to this country as refugees, we're going to ban them because 10 years from now they might become terrorists. For instance, in the 1920s and 1930s, would it have been our policy to say, well, if you're from Sicily, which millions of people came to this country from, you know, because there was a possibility you might become a member of the mafia 10 years down the road, we're not going to let you in. This is the logic of this ban. It doesn't make sense.
Well, I don't necessarily agree with you on that, and I don't necessarily see it as a ban either, as more of a resetting to understand and make sure that the vetting process is correct and appropriate. And it seems in a way that you're advocating for, unless there's broad and wide-scale mayhem and destruction, that we need to be reactive as opposed to proactive. And I think it's the duty of...
Of course I'm not advocating that.
Well, so...
What I'm saying is the problem is an American domestic problem. I mean, every lethal terrorist attack in this country has been carried out by an American citizen or a legal permanent resident. I mean, the issue is radicalization here, not...
But doesn't it seems to fly in the face. I mean, if the police are searching for a serial killer, but something requires them to look at the whole panoply of everybody that was killed in the city, doesn't it kind of fly in the face that you need to focus your efforts on the things that make sense, that connect and are common to the acts that are committed, that the things that are common? You have to focus your efforts there, because that tells the story of maybe why, who, how these things are happening. And if we just say, well, these things are happening everywhere, and there's no commonality of origin or ideology, I think we're going to miss the mark.
Are you suggesting that we should ban travel from France?
No, I'm not suggesting that. But I'm suggesting that some countries, sim geography, have a higher incidence. And just like as the chairman said, the administration prior to this one recognized the exact same thing. And as it's stated, as you call it, a ban, to me it's just a time out to make sure that we're doing everything we can appropriately regarding the countries that we find most at risk. It's essentially just renewing your insurance policy and looking at the risks that you have, as opposed to being reactive. We're being proactive. Let me just move on a little bit regarding the Muslim Brotherhood and designating them. I'm sure you're familiar with the Holy Land Foundation investigation and civilization jihad, right?
Yeah.
So should we, because we have relations and relationships with countries that recognize the Muslim Brotherhood, most recently, I'm sure you're aware that Egypt, although democratically elected, rejected the Muslim Brotherhood and listed them themselves. But you know, we've had conversations with the likes of Saddam Hussein, the Castro regime, the North Koreans. Meanwhile, we designate them in some effect as hostile actors. Can we not have our cake and eat it too? Can we not recognize that these individuals and these organizations have a design to overturn our government, our way of life in some cases, and in many cases, even though that they are on the world stage and are world actors, and we must have a relationship and some kind of dialogue with them, but to understand what their clear intentions are and take action regarding their intentions?
I think conflating the North Korean government with the Muslim Brotherhood is to make a category error.
Okay, go ahead.
After all, I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood is the government or part of the government in many of our closest allies. I mean, are you going to criminalize the leaders of the Iraqi government who are helping us in Mosul? Are you going to criminalize the Jordanian members of parliament who are members of the Muslim Brotherhood, or the Kuwaiti members of parliament who are members of the Muslim Brotherhood? Are we going to behave like the Egyptian dictatorship, Sisi, who criminalized the largest opposition party in his own country? Are you endorsing that?
What I'm endorsing is that the United States needs to be vigilant regarding individuals and organizations that seek our destruction and our downfall, and acting like, as they wander among us in town, that they don't have that intent when they have shown that a very express intent is suicidal, and for a nation. And while it might not be the best vehicle, I think it raises the bar and puts those organizations on notice that we understand what their intentions are, and though we might have to deal with them, and we should deal with them for the good of mankind, we understand and recognize and disagree with their intentions. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield.
Kathleen?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
As a district attorney before I was here, I was very concerned on gender violence issues, particularly sexual assault, domestic violence. And the National Task Force on Ending Sexual and Domestic Violence recently stated that the executive order would endanger the safety of victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, and human trafficking, their families, and communities at large, further isolate victims, and erect barriers to establish legal protections for those victims. Mr. Bergen, can you comment on that?
I don't actually know, sir.
Any of our panelists could comment on that? All right. I just wanted to also, we're making great success shrinking the footprint militarily with ISIL. One of the things that we're also making great success with, that's probably less publicized, is the way we're shrinking their financing as well. We're doing it with our elimination of their oil refineries and resources. They're doing it as we shrink the land because they can't tax the way that they could before. And the other two issues are really the use of hostages and ransom and the trading illegally in antiquities and cultural artifacts. How are we doing on those other points? I know we're doing well, you know, on shrinking the footprint, which again deals with the taxing issue. But if you can just comment on how we're doing on those fronts.
Very well. ISIS has halved its salaries. You know, we dropped a big bomb in the United States on one of their banks with they had a lot of their money, and the New York Post had one of the best headlines of all time: United States makes big deposit. So we have really kind of constrained, you know, they're running a 30,000 man, 20,000 man army. It costs money. We have really put a hurt on that. They're running, and one of the reasons we're seeing child soldiers, by the way, now is they're running out of manpower. We're seeing more and more child soldiers. So I think the approach is working. They're slowly being strangled.
Okay. Yes.
I think one of the key things on the kidnap for ransom issue is making sure that everybody's on the same page, because there are some countries which take this very seriously in terms of not paying kidnap money to ISIS. The US takes it very seriously. The UK takes it very seriously. Some of the US's European allies have been harder to persuade and actually are paying kidnap ransom money, and ISIS and Al-Qaeda, other groups are able to sustain themselves because of it. Also, when you look at I think that I agree entirely with Peter on some of the progress that's being made in the Middle East. But remember, some of the ISIS cells in Europe, for example, are kind of, I mean, some of these are lower level criminals who've got other ways of fundraising that are more, you know, something closer aligned with criminal gangs and gangsters. So there are multiple prongs that we need to be aware of.
You know, there were some designations by the U.S. government last year dealing in the aftermath of counterterrorism raids against ISIS in Deir ez-Zor and the leadership there, where what the documentation that was recovered showed extensive trading in antiquities from Palmyra and elsewhere in Syria and Iraq on the black market. It's very difficult to get a sense of what the total income is from this activity because it is illicit, because it's in the black market. And there were many trades that were discovered during those raids that were unknown. You know, there were artifacts that were basically being put up on the block that were previously unknown to be in their possession. So it's very difficult on that aspect, which is only one of many the revenues they are bringing in, to get a good sense of just how prolific they have been and perhaps could be in the future. I do think overall their finances have absolutely been hurt. On the kidnapping for ransom, again, you know, I know I'm the Al-Qaeda guy, I'll keep coming back to it, but this is one of those areas where they've been a little more sophisticated than ISIS in terms of getting kidnapping for ransoms, because they've been able to maintain friendly relations with certain Gulf countries that have basically brokered very lucrative deals for them at times for UN people who were kidnapped near the Golan Heights, UN workers and employees, for high-profile Americans and others, where they've been able to trade for millions and millions of dollars and earn ransoms. This is part of their strategy all the way from West Africa all the way to South Asia and through the heart of the Middle East. So it's something to keep an eye on. And as Robin said, some countries are good on it, others, a lot of them, in fact, are not. And so that's part of the problem.
So it's something we should work with our friends in. Another question. Did you want to talk about Mr. Davis? Sorry.
I just wanted to mention that beyond kinetic weapons, the financial investigations and also shutting down of these websites or targeting the people who are responsible for them, who are activating people in our country, has been very effective. And I don't understand why we can't shut down their magazines, why pursuing that on the internet and immediately shutting down the publications of these magazines that extol this radicalism and attacks against us couldn't be done more frequently.
Yeah, it wasn't long ago that I was in Tunisia, and here's a concern I have. Tunisia, as I think most of you know, has the highest per capita number of foreign terrorist fighters, and they're coming back. Some of them are going back through Libya, but some of the, many are coming right back to Tunisia, which is a pretty fragile country right now, and they're not alone, but I'll use them as an example. When we're cutting as a country our ability to help countries like that are in crisis at this point, how dangerous is that to do that? Because you've got a fragile country, you've got a high amount now of returning foreign terrorist fighters that they don't know how to deal with, according to reports. This is a great example how the U.S., I believe, intervention there to help that country, through the state side, could be so critical and keep us safer. Would you like to comment on that, the need of doing that, and why maybe making sure we have funding to help at these critical times is important?
Yeah, Tunisia is obviously a very clear country of concern, and actually I was speaking to the German government recently, who one of their main concerns at the moment is they have lots of Tunisians in Germany that they are trying to, that they regard as a threat or who shouldn't be there, trying to deport back to Tunisia, and Tunisia are saying, we just don't want them back, right? I mean, they already feel as if they're a threat, they're already under severe, terrorist alert as it is, and so I think that's an area where the U.S. has got to take the lead in helping coordinate that kind of thing.
Well, thank you very much. Are you done, Mr. Joslin?
Can I just add a here on Tunisia? I mean, that basically this is one of the few countries that come out of the Arab uprisings that has a chance to actually for a better future at this point. And I think that America should scale up its efforts to support the Tunisian forces there instead of the opposite. This is the Tunisian case is a country. I'm sorry, is inextricably linked to Libya and the flow of fighters back and forth. Which basically, if you start looking at the whole situation, if we're not bolstering Tunisia, then we start to allow them to have a greater operating access across the North Africa. And so Tunisia is one of those key countries right now. And any strategist looking at the jihadi threat has to look at Tunisia as sort of a key roadblock, possibly, to what the jihadis are doing.
Great. Thank you very much.
First of all, let me thank the witnesses for the testimony. I think this was a very worthwhile hearing. Testimony was very illuminating. I think the dialogue between the members and the witnesses was very constructive. So I want to thank you really for your testimony. Thank you for all the work you've done with the committee in the past. And hopefully we can see you again in the future. And any advice you have for us along the way, any input, we certainly welcome it, including yours, Mr. Bergen, really, believe me. No, thank you all very much. And with that, the hearing stands adjourned.